Hello, Smart Cities Conference. I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to come on. My name is Scott Beyer, and I am an urban policy journalist who is based in the United States. And today I'm going to give you a talk about an urban policy theory that I believe is going to be beneficial not only to cities, but to the people who live in them. And the name of that policy theory is market urbanism. And I will share my presentation with you. What is market urbanism? And before I get into that talk, let me just introduce myself. So, as I said, I'm based in the United States. I've done a lot of travel through the United States and am somewhat of what you could call a roving journalist. I write columns for Governing Magazine, HousingOnline.com, and the California-based Independent Institute. And I'm owner of Market Urbanism Report, which is a media company dedicated to advancing free market urban policy. If you don't already know what Market Urbanism Report is, I would encourage you to look into it. We write weekly articles, we have a podcast, we're about to roll out a video series, and a 50,000 person social media following, which is very engaged, and I would even say rabid. And if you are interested in urban issues or free market capitalism, I very much recommend you joining our movement, because it's not just me, but it's several staffers, and more importantly, it's thousands of people across the world who are interested in these issues that are in my Facebook group and on my Twitter feed and so forth. So, market urbanism. It's a policy theory that applies free market economics to urban issues. And I would say that the central premise of market urbanism is that cities are currently run and planned and organized by government action, bureaucracy, central planning. And the essential market urbanism message is that this has been a bad thing for cities. It has caused cities to run less efficiently and be poorer, and generally not organized in a way that really improves the lives of citizens. And the idea of market urbanism is saying that if cities were more capitalistic and dictated more by private sector activity and the whims of the consumer and the individual, that they would be better organized and they would better fit the needs of everyday people. And so that is it's market urbanism is effectively a classical liberal theory that calls for self-organization and organic upward bottom-up growth in cities rather than top-down government planning. To get more specific, I'd say that market urbanism is really two things. It is a theory and it is a policy package. And I'll get into both of those. Market urbanism, the theory, is effectively asking, if cities did not have governments and if they were not planned by the government, how would they work? So effectively, if they were just private corporations or entities and they were premised on freedom and liberalization, how would they work? And the reason I call that a theory is that it's very unusual and has not really been tried around the world, at least not in recent centuries. If you go to the big cities today, whether it's New York City or Rio or Paris, they're government-run entities and they are planned by the government. And so market urbanism is asking the theoretical question, what if this were not the case? What if private sector activity was what completely dictated how cities operate? But again, not very frequent. You can look to specific examples like a private corporation is trying to build a city in Honduras right now called Prospera. And you could say that Singapore has kind of a privatized model, city-state model, but overall, cities are generally government run. Market urbanism as a policy package is different. It is not a theory. In this case, market urbanists are looking at specific cities that already exist and are run by the government and are saying, what are market-oriented reforms that kind of push in the direction of libertarianism or capitalism, uh, and and would improve the status quo that we have now. This version of market urbanism is to me more interesting because it's more pragmatic in the sense that it can actually be applied to cities here and now, in a way that is politically likely to pass. And so this is the version of market urbanism that I focus on and that I will go through for the rest of the talk. So market urbanism as a policy package really applies to two things in my mind. One of them is housing. The second is transportation. And the thing that we are trying to focus on with housing is the fact that it's highly unaffordable. That's the case in the United States, and it's really the case all over the world. And we're saying that if the housing market, and the reason that housing is unaffordable is often because land in the development process is controlled by the government. And we are effectively saying, abolish that idea. Let housing respond to market forces and consumer demands, and let it be more elastic and flexible to the whims of the private individual. So housing can be built in the location, at the size, in the design, and at the density that the consumer wants. And so some of the specific reforms we talk about with housing, zoning, we do not think that zoning should exist as a concept. Zoning is often used to police the density and the design of housing, and we think that that is a violation of property rights, and that something like zoning should not exist. Another reform that we attack is parking minimums. Nowadays, when developers in the United States, and it's probably the case in Brazil as well, when they try to build a structure, they have to build a minimum amount of parking. We do not think that regulation should exist, and that the amount of parking that a developer builds should be determined by the market, what consumers actually want. Building codes. Building codes in theory would seem like they're a good idea, because nobody wants to live in a structure that, because it was built in a structurally deficient way, could fall down. But in my mind, building codes are often excessive, and they get captured by certain industry interests, and this drives up the price of projects and housing. And so I would say that building codes either need to be minimalized quite a bit, or they should probably not exist. And there are private sector mechanisms that still ensure that buildings will be well built. And I'm thinking specifically of the insurance industry, that if you're an insurer who insures a building, you're not going to insure one that and foot that risk for a building that has not been built properly. Another thing that market urbanists are against are urban growth boundaries. And these are arbitrary lines that are drawn around metro areas that prevent suburban sprawl. My opinion is that this increases the cost of housing, that suburban sprawl is often an organic result of market growth and population increases, and that when you put a boundary around a metro, it causes an artificial shortage of land that increases home prices. Perhaps more importantly, though, market urbanists are against regulations that limit density. So here in the U.S., we have limits against building height, floor area ratio, which polices the bulk of a building and width, and DUA, dwelling units per acre, which polices how many people can live on a specific plot of land, the number of dwelling units. I'm against those regulations too. I think that if cities did not have these types of regulations, they could be much more vertical and compact, and develop more along mass transit lines, which I'll get to in a second, and that's kind of a goal of urbanism in general, that I think we all need to realize that the reason cities cannot be more dense and transit oriented is because there's often government regulations that prevent them from growing in this way. But I think the main thing that market urbanists want to attack is just the general idea that the housing market should be planned, that a government planning board can determine, okay, well, this is our population, so this is the number of units we need. I think that there are informational problems with that thinking, and I think that the private sector is going to have a better sense of how much housing the market needs based on existing price information and the population inflows and the number of people who actually want to live in a given area. And so I'm very against the idea of having a planning review process or a design review process that dictates whether or not a given project can be approved. Now on to transportation. So this is kind of the second part of market urbanism. I think a lot of times people ask, well, if you're if you're advocating for this urban policy theory that is going to jam a bunch of people into a city and there aren't going to be regulations, isn't that going to cause more of like a tragedy of the commons type scenario? Isn't, for example, it's going to it's going to cause congestion and gridlock and overcrowd the transportation system? And I would actually say, no, I don't believe that, because I think that if we allow the market to work for transportation, that a lot of people's mobility needs will be addressed by private companies, where currently it is not addressed because the government bureaucracy often plans and dictates transportation grids. So market urbanism idea for transportation is that it can be provided along the routes, in the modes, and through the operators chosen by the consumer. Probably the most important aspect of the market urbanism transportation theory is the idea of road pricing. If you have roads that are congested, the best way to do that is through demand management, aka through pricing the road. So there is something called dynamic based pricing, which is the idea that when roads are really crowded, the price of using them, aka the toll, goes up. When roads are not crowded, the toll goes down. And that is able to that ends up dispersing demand across different parts of the day so that you don't have congestion. Another thing that road pricing accomplishes is it creates a revenue stream to then pay for the maintenance of the road. So this is a movement away from the socialized version of road provision, where you just tax people and then pay for the road. This enables the people who actually use the road and benefit from the road to pay for it. Another big market urbanist public transit reform is the reform of public transit. And what I'm saying here effectively is that the fact that government bureaucracy runs transit often leads to certain public choice flaws. There's a lot of inefficiency and, in general, just mismanagement of funds within the transit industry as the result of it being government run. And my idea is that public transit should be reformed more to allow private sector principles. So one example I could point to here would be something like MTR in Hong Kong. They participate in something called a value capture strategy, where the rail line owns a lot of the land around the line, and they build very densely along the line rather than underutilizing the land. And this creates certain revenue streams that then get thrown back into the rail and help the rail to be sustainable and solvent and well used. I think those kind of privatization and private sector reforms should be applied to transit systems all over the world. In the same vein, I think that we should have private transit deregulation so that there is a competitor against the government model. So I'm sure you're familiar in Brazil, and it's really a worldwide phenomenon that there are a lot of private transit providers, particularly you can call them jitneys, collectivos, people who want to run their own small bus that goes along their own route based on what their specific customers want and where they want to go. Those types of services, particularly in the United States, are often illegal. And the reason they're illegal is because the public agency doesn't want any competition. I would say that anytime you have a private entrepreneur who wants to provide a certain mobility service, they should be allowed to do that. And that would create what I like to call a mass transport buffet of different options that people can use if they want to get from point A to point B in a city. Market-based right-of-way. And what I mean here is the pricing of right-of-way within a city rather than the open use of it, the free use of it. And I'm talking here specifically about curbs. I think if you look at a place like New York City, a lot of the curb space is given away for free to certain interests, particularly the automobile and people who own a car that they just want to use for car storage. I think that by pricing the right of way, aka free markets, particularly for curb space, you'll start to get alternative uses. So we were seeing that a little bit during the pandemic where because restaurants could not allow customers inside, they began to set up shop on the curb space outside. And so they were actually paying the city Department of Transportation a fee to be able to use the curb space rather than that space just being given away for free cars. And I think that sort of market-based price mechanism would be a great way to organize urban right-of-way. So conclusion, market urbanism is the cross between free market policy and urban issues. It's a classically liberal idea, rooted from the economists like Hayek and Adam Smith. We call for voluntary exchange within cities and the prioritization of the private sector and private individuals embracing the capitalistic process rather than a more socialized process where government bureaucracies plan and operate cities from the top down. I think that the two applications that are most apt for market urbanism are housing and transportation, but you can apply it to all kinds of aspects of city life, everything from privatizing garbage pickup to having private schools rather than public schools. I think all aspects of a city ultimately should be left up to individual choice and the consumer preference rather than the whims of government. And so that's the basis of market urbanism. You can read more about it on that link below. And if you want to get involved in the movement, which, by the way, brings together people who are both interested in cities and people who are interested in classical liberalism and capitalist economics, there's all kinds of, we have multiple platforms on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. And of course, if you're interested in my ideas, you can always email me as well. Thanks again for letting me talk. And I look forward to hearing what you think of my ideas and how you think the market urbanism philosophy can apply to your city. Thanks again. Bye.